We are pleased to host Jim Nickelson, and we're pleased to continue to be a part of the Camden Conference events. This year, the Camden Conference is the geopolitics of the Arctic, a region in peril. And they've hosted many excellent events via Zoom, and this one I'm sure is going to be fantastic as well. I'm going to turn things over to Sue Michaelowicz of the Camden Conference Community Events Committee, and she will introduce this evening's talk. So thank you, Sue.
Thank you. Thank you for all being here. Before I forget, on the right-hand column, there's a chat box. You can get the link to the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we're going to be taking questions at first by chat, and then live in person if you would like to speak up after Jim does his presentation. We feel that's the best way to handle it since we're expecting up to 40 or 50 participants tonight. Jim comes from an extremely interesting background, a triangle of a career, beginning as a NASA engineer. And then I guess because that wasn't quite enough, he went to Harvard Law School and practiced law. Then he turned his life into being a photographer, printer, and teacher in Camden, Maine. A few of you on here are probably taking classes with Jim. He's a master teacher, an excellent printer, prints a lot of work for artists in our area and out of the area, including me. And he also is the author of the Fine Inkjet Printing book. That's a techniques book and a concepts book about printing. If you're a photographer and don't have one, you should have one. If you are a photographer and have one, buy another one and give it to a friend. But that's not the topic of the talk tonight. Jim's had a wide experience in artist residencies in Acadia National Park, in Arizona, at Kazan Lake in Maine, and also in Iceland. And he's going to talk about his Iceland experience tonight. Jim, I'm turning it over to you. Thanks for being here and spending your time with us.
Oh, thank you very much. And thank you, Sue, and thank you to the Camden Conference, and thank you, Patty, and the Rockland Library, and thank everyone who's joined us tonight. I think this will be a lot of fun, and I think that, hopefully distraction from, news of the various types that are out there in the world. So so I'm just going to jump right into my presentation here, and let's just make sure. Okay. Let's just make sure this is going like I think. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about is a residency that I had in Iceland and the impact that had on the direction of my work. Now, back in 2018, I was awarded an artist residency in Iceland in this little town called Hofsós. And for those of you who aren't in the art world, an artist residency is usually something where it's competitive, you apply for it. And if you're awarded it, you basically get a free place to stay somewhere. Usually you're on your own for the travel, and but at least give you a free place to stay and kind of an opportunity to go to this location. And for me, I'd never been to Iceland. And so this was really just a wonderful opportunity for me. And Hofsós is on the northern coast of Iceland. And for anyone who's been to Iceland, and I know a lot of people have, most of the population and a lot of the activities are in the southwest corner of the island near Reykjavik, where the airport is. And a lot of the big tourist destinations are on the southern coast. And so the northern coast, where I was, is actually a very quiet part of Iceland. And, the scale of Iceland is hard to picture if you haven't been there. It's actually, not that large. You could actually, there's a road called the Ring Road that goes all the way around the island. And it's about 830 miles if you drove it from Reykjavik to Reykjavik around the whole island. And that's actually what I ended up doing in my trip in 2018. On that trip, my residency was actually only for 7 days, or 7 nights, 8 days, 7 nights. And what I did was I basically took 3 or 4 days going up the West Coast to get there and stopping at a lot of places on the way up. And then I took about 6 or 7 days afterwards to work my way around the right half of the island back to the airport on the way out. So it was about 18 days total that I was there. Now, Hofsós itself is a very small town, and it's on a fjord that's facing the Arctic Ocean. Now the place that, just a second here. Okay, the place where I had the artist residency is a place called the Baer Art Center. And the woman who runs this actually built this facility, which I'm going to show you in a second, for the purpose of artist residencies. And they have artists of all types come there, and you know, in different, sometimes there's space for 5 or 6 people at once at this place. And the location is actually on a what they call a saltwater horse farm. So it's basically a farm that goes down to the ocean where they raise Icelandic horses, which are very kind of famous for people who are into horses. And it's very much a matter of pride in the country of Iceland. This is basically what it looked like when I first arrived. I had to take pictures for what it looked like for my family back home. And the building with the sod roof is where everything is. That's where there were actually 5 of us there, 5 photographers there on this trip for these 8 days. And the rooms that we stayed in were in this space, and there's some common areas as well. And you can see off to the left on the lower left photograph how basically the farm that this is on drops off and goes all the way down towards the ocean. And you'll see out in the ocean there's an island, and that's on the far left, and the giant rock that's partially obscured by the building. They call that the Cape. I never figured out what the actual name of it is, but they call it the Cape. That island that you see on the left is going to come up a bit later too. Let's see. This is what it looks like inside, just for out of curiosity. So this is the great room. That's a common area that we would share and make meals together. Because there are very few restaurants or anything even close to where we were, and kind of out overlooking the ocean. And on the right is the studio that was in the room I was in. It was basically a bedroom and a studio, and all the residents had that. You may notice that these pictures is very gray, and that's actually how it looked for, I think I was in Iceland for 8 days before I saw the sun. It was gray and cloudy and rainy pretty much for the first half of my trip. And really, I only ended up having 3 days of sun during the entire 18 days I was there. That being said, it was still amazingly beautiful. And this kind of gives you an idea of what I was doing in terms of the shooting conditions. This is a beach on the western coast, and I just got used to being wet all the time. And all my gear was wet, all my clothes were wet, everything was wet. And it usually was not raining really hard, but it's usually raining just a little bit. But when the sun did come out, it was pretty amazingly glorious. It was the time of year I was there. It was basically end of July, early August. It wasn't quite the midnight sun, but it was pretty close. The sun only dropped below the horizon for about 2 hours, and it didn't drop very far. So you ended up with that lovely, amazing light for pretty much all the time. It never actually got dark. And so that's the photo on the left is a picture of the great room when that first day when the sun actually came out. And the photograph on the right is actually a view from the ocean looking back up towards the residency. So that the building in the center is the one where I was staying, and the house on the right, just to the right of that, is actually where the woman who owns the facility. That's where she lives part of the time. So I'm going to first start off with pictures I took from those 8 days in the residency area, and this is the rock that they call the Cape. And as I mentioned, there's the light was pretty spectacular, and it was pretty spectacular for very long periods of time. It was actually somewhat exhausting because you would photograph till midnight or 1, and it was still great light. And so eventually, and because it had been dark and rainy so long, that I exhausted myself for about 36 hours when the sun actually came out. And then but then it went away again, so it kind of solved that. But then went back to a more normal schedule. But yeah, so you just get a kind of a feel for this. So this is looking into the fjord, and just kind of the light in that surrounding area. And and this is a photograph. It's maybe about an hour north of where the residency was, so really on the northern tip of Iceland. And this is probably like 1 o'clock in the morning, so the sun is down, and just this soft pink light, and combined with the fog and the mountains, and it was very spectacular. Just to give a little bit of the scale, this is a town. It's probably about, like I said, about an hour north of Hofsós. Just south of Hofsos, there actually was a black sand beach, which I went to photograph quite a few times. One of the other photographers with me was actually from Reykjavik. He was German by birth, but he was living in Reykjavik, and he knew a lot of kind of off the beaten path areas. And just incidentally, the five photographers, there was him who was Icelandic and German, and there were 3 Americans, a woman and a woman from Singapore were the mix of people we had. But Iceland's certainly known for its black sand beaches too. And one of something I've always been interested in, something that was one of the focal points of the residency, was close-in work. And that's what the idea was. The 5 photographers are all people who like doing abstract type work, things that were kind of intimate landscapes, intimate views of nature. And so this is from that same black sand beach. And so we ended up doing a lot of, going out in small groups, ad hoc, or going off on our own, and doing a lot of that type of photography when I was during the days I was at that residency. Something that's always a sweet spot for me, something I always look for when I'm photographing in nature, are things that look to me like things that look like landscapes but are not, I guess is the way of saying it. So so I spent many an afternoon on that black sand beach trying to photograph the foam and try to get things that that kind of gave me the look that I wanted with these. And so I really explored a lot of that in a more the residency gave me a chance to explore that in a more concentrated way than I normally would here at home. And that the structure called the Cape, the rock called the Cape, was actually about 1.5 miles away on these walking on these rocks. And so we went out there a couple times, and there were all kinds of finds, things in the rocks that were a good chance to photograph as well. So there were a lot of different opportunities in that area. So just a really, it's a great location, a lot of variety. And when the light was cooperative, then it was, and even when it wasn't, it was still a lot of great things to photograph. But kind of my mental energy when I was, those 8 days I was in a residency, was really directed towards what the other residents jokingly called my island, because basically I was obsessed with that island and how it changed with different lighting conditions. And so this is actually a photograph of my camera pointing just like I set it up. And I basically, over those 8 days, I kept on going back and making the same shot over and over and over again. But because the light was changed so dramatically so quickly, it really was kind of an amazing, well, you'll see, but it's like, you'll see how much it varies, but it was amazing to me to see how much the conditions change day to day, minute to minute, hour to hour. And so I'm just going to give you a sampling of the ones that some of these photographs I took over the 8 days of my island. The island is called Drangey, Drangey. It's actually kind of a well-known island in Icelandic folklore and mythology. And it's like there used to be that rock that's on the left that is almost like a finger pointing up, is actually in the mythology, it's a troll that has been turned to stone when the sun came out and trapped the troll and turned it to stone. So there used to be a second one on the right before my time, like that, but it collapsed 70 or 80 years ago. So now there's just the one that's on the left of the island. So you can see how, in these different lighting conditions, it really was pretty dramatic. Actually, one thing, sometimes photographers talk about the shot that got away, and we actually, in the evening, pretty consistently, there would be whales that would pass from north to south and between us and the island. And I was trying to get some of these whales and the spouting in the photograph. And one time I finally caught it, because it happened so quickly, it was hard to anticipate. And somehow my settings were screwed up and I wasn't focused. So actually I didn't get the picture. It was very small in the picture anyway. It was basically a white dot. But it's the photograph that didn't work out. And so I ended up building a portfolio of 12 of these photographs of Drangey together. So that's all that. And so this one this is kind of, again, just from the general area. And this one, I really like it just because it actually reminds me of Maine. It feels like this is a photograph that I've made before here in the coast of Maine. And really there were a lot of similarities in terms of climate, in terms of just the look of the area between coastal Maine and Iceland. And I mean, Iceland has a pretty varied terrain, so there's parts that don't look like Maine at all, but I definitely felt at home. So these are all, again, kind of photographs from the fjord. And this is actually my island, Drangey, from the south. So you're kind of looking at it from, like, if looking at it from this direction, if you look to the right, that's where you would see the, where my residence was. So I was looking at it from the right direction from this. So now this is actually when I first got there, when I rented a car to get there, and this is the shot. This is what it looked like when I arrived. It was this little a different island, Malmi, that was just a beautiful light. So just a few other photographs from kind of this area, and as I traveled around before I transitioned into kind of my bigger topic. One thing Iceland is also very well known for is geothermal activity, and there are a lot of different places you can go if that's something of interest to you, and just really amazingly geologically diverse. Sometimes I'm going to try to pronounce these names, sometimes I'm not. This is one I'm not going to try. Krafla, I'll try this one. So this is a volcanic area, and there's actually a lot of geothermal energy produced at this location. So you have to, actually, it's difficult to photograph it if you don't want to show the hand of man in it, because there's actually a lot of the geothermal areas here have basic structures around them to capture the energy and can use it for electricity. And this is over in the southwest corner of Iceland, actually kind of near the airport, but it's really part of the, otherworldly, or even like it makes me think of medieval, or, it's really kind of just a very unique landscape. And this is another place. I didn't get any photographs I really loved in terms of this, but it was just a beautiful canyon that you basically couldn't go down to the bottom of it. You kind of walked along the edge of it. And yet another name I'm not going to try to pronounce. This one, the Horns, is another one that's on the east coast of Iceland as part of my trip around. And and I wish in hindsight, I didn't realize you could actually get a lot closer than I was here. But so this is kind of as close as I got to those mountains, but they were pretty unique and distinct. So this is the last one of this set, and this is a kind of a famous area for geothermal activity. And not that this picture is not that, but this is the Mývatn area. I think is how you pronounce that. Is just a really a popular area and a great place to add to your visit, to get away from kind of the more crowded areas. But for me, one of the things that was what I really wanted to see in Iceland more than anything was glaciers. And that was really kind of my main focus. And there really weren't any glaciers that were accessible near where I was staying for my residency. So this became my focus on those days before and after my residency. And so I'm going to highlight a couple different ones that I was able to go and photograph. And so this is a pretty well-known one because it's in one of the big national parks on this. And the ones that I was able to visit were mostly on the southern coast of Iceland. There was one on the western coast too. You just get a sense of the scale of these when you see them with the mountains here. And, like glaciers everywhere in the world, these glaciers are very much in retreat. So here on the lower right of this photograph, you can see they call it a glacial lagoon and some of the icebergs floating in it, which is beautiful, but also indicative, of what's happening, which is that the glacier is retreating. Because basically, as the glacier retreats, it leaves holes behind that fill with water, and you can, and so I've only been to Iceland this one time, so I don't have a historical basis for it, but I saw a lot of photographs of what these looked like in the past, and this is really, I'd known intellectually about the retreat of glaciers, but until seeing the scale in person and kind of seeing the evidence of how much they've retreated from there, that really hit it home in a way that I hadn't appreciated until seeing this. And so I really started reconsidering what I was doing, because I've always photographed landscape and nature, and that's been my primary focus and still is. But I was always very determined to be essentially non-political with my work, and I was trying to make it, art for art's sake, I guess is the way of saying it. And after this trip, I really started to rethink what I was doing with that, and so this kind of led me to, from the plane ride back and onward, to reconsider what I wanted to do with these photographs and with future photographs. And I'm going to kind of show you some of the stuff that I came up with as ways to try to turn what I love to do, which is take photographs of beautiful things and make something new and beautiful, the photograph and the print, the resulting print. And I'll demonstrate what I'm doing. So just I've just been moving the photographs along as I've been talking, but unfortunately, because of my time limitations, I was trying to get around the whole island and didn't have a long time. I didn't get to spend very long at very many of these. Most of these glaciers that I visited, I was only able to see for an afternoon, a morning, and I got really lucky that the weather was pretty dramatic when I was there. So I was able to, in 3 hours at this glacier, I was able to catch and see things like the sun bursting through in a beam and hitting the glacier. And the scale of this is immense. I mean, this is probably, a quarter mile or half mile across if you measured it, and relatively far away. But it's, just, I always had wanted to see these in person. I was so ecstatic to finally get to do so. And so I'm going to come back to this photograph in a few minutes. And this was kind of probably my favorite one from this glacier. And so now I'm going to kind of pivot a little bit and talk about the project that I've started working on, where these photographs became the inspiration. And the new project that I'm working on is called the Anthropocene Surveys. And it's basically, I was inspired in a lot of ways in terms of this idea, with what are known as the Great Surveys of the American West, where photographers like Timothy O'Sullivan went out with these scientific teams to explore the Western United States. And this was in the 1860s, 1870s timeframe. And so the idea, the conceit that I'm working with here is that there's something new called the Anthropocene Surveys, and that are being conducted from 2017, just before my trip, until sometime when I stopped doing this. And the idea behind this is the idea of sending photographers, which that makes it sound more dramatic than sending myself, to capture natural wonders that are going to be irrevocably changed by a warming planet for the benefit of future generations. Just to further explain this, the Anthropocene is a word you may have seen, because it's kind of having a moment now where a lot of people are using that phrase. And it's something that's still in dispute as to whether this is actually a real thing or not, in terms of the geologists. I mean, I think scientists of all types are willing to argue about a lot of things, and this is definitely one about. But the idea about the Anthropocene is that humans have caused essentially a new geologic era, a new geologic epoch, and that at some point in the last years, and we've entered this new era where the hand of man has a bigger influence than anything else, essentially, and that this is going to be defined for future generations as beginning of an era, and people can't agree whether this is actually a new era or not, and people can't agree on when it would start. One idea I see thrown around a lot is, as a starting point to something along the lines of the first nuclear explosion. That's a sign of, if you had to pick a time when man became powerful enough to change the world, that would be a good start. People have looked at other things, in terms of, the invention of farming, or something, many thousands of years ago. There's all kinds of different ways of thinking about it. And so it's been fun to research these different ideas, but ultimately I'm just stealing the name and in terms of my project. And so my idea is that I'm going to go to different locations like Iceland in 2018, and like last fall I went to the Northern Rockies and photographed all over Canada and northern United States and so on. And I'm going to imagine the way I'm going to present this work, whether it's in book form or gallery form, or exhibition form, is going to imagine this as a museum exhibition in the future, about 100 years in the future, looking back at these surveys that were conducted 100 years before. So this is something that is hypothetical. It's something that is not actually happened yet, but I've written this text to go along with a lot of these photographs that basically the text is in past tense. It's basically what a museum curator in 2117 would write about this photograph and what's happened. It'll make more sense as I kind of show things, and it's a little tricky to explain, but I just want to highlight one thing, which is that the text that I'm writing is based on real and valid scientifically based projections. I'm reading these articles about when this glacier is going to melt, when this bird is going to become extinct, so on and so forth, and extrapolating from that to come up with these. I'm not making things up, and it's kind of a moving target because the science is changing and as we go. One last thing I want to mention about art as activism, I always try to avoid it, and I really struggle with how best to do it. And the other way I'm approaching this project is that in a lot of ways, the photographs are going to be pretty straight. Like they're photographs that are, photographs of, beautiful photographs of beautiful things in a way. But I think that that's important for the activism part in terms of increasing awareness for climate change, because I want to try to get to people who wouldn't normally be receptive to this. I think about my father as, in Texas, where I'm from, and very resistant to the idea of climate change. But for people like him, like my own father, what's actually worked in the past in terms of convincing them to join in with an environmental cause is showing them something beautiful that may be lost. And that's really as simple as that. And so that's kind of the approach I'm taking with this. So let me show you a little bit how this is kind of playing out. So this is the cover sheet for the portfolio I'm putting together of the Iceland images you're going to see going forward. And so this is the first Iceland survey. Hopefully I'll have more, but for obvious reasons, I haven't been back this year, and hopefully I'll be able to kind of go back in the future. So this photograph I showed you before, so let me just give you an example of the text that we have for this. And so, I'm trying to write this in the voice of a museum in a way. So it's not confrontational, and it's kind of more more informational and kind of just talking about something that is become past tense when I'm writing this. So unfortunately, this glacial tongue that I photographed will be gone, and the projections are, I think, it's another 50 or 60 years, and it's going to have retreated many miles from where I was. And so certainly even now, what I photographed is much different than it was when I saw it. So let me show you some other glaciers that I was able to photograph. This one is actually very close to the one I just showed you, and it's again a very large glacier, but in pretty heavy retreat. And this kind of gives you a bit of sense of the scale of it. And it's because one thing I like about making photographs like this is that it kind of removes all sense of scale, but of course it removes all sense of scale, so it's hard to know sometimes. But this, again, these are pretty large structures that are pretty far away that I'm photographing. And so it's, I don't have a measurement for it, but it's definitely, hundreds of yards across, we'll say, so it's quite a large glacier as it exists now. And but really just, it's, I try to get as close to these as I could, safely. And most of them are pretty, most of the ones I was able to visit are pretty accessible to visitors. So they kind of are conducive to that, but it's definitely not like, here in the United States, where there would be kind of a viewing platform with a fence and everything else. It's definitely much more informal than that. So the photographs I just showed you, this is actually how my camera was set up for those, just to kind of give you an idea, because the glacier is to the left in this photograph, so that's why the camera's pointing that way. And you can see the lagoon that is formed in front of it as the icebergs calve off into that. One thing I noticed after spending a whole morning here is there was a little sign on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper saying, warning, the mountain may collapse at any time. Don't spend too long here. That's basically what it said in English. And I couldn't believe it said that, and it was just on a small sign, and there was no warning before that. But what was happening was this. So this is what I was looking at. What was happening was basically, as the glacier retreats, and I talk about that in this text, as the glacier retreats, the mountain that is left behind shifts, and in cracks form, and eventually that mountainside might collapse. And they'd actually had the right where I was standing, the mountain 3 years before had actually slipped and fallen, slipped a few feet, and they expected any time it was going to collapse. So when I wrote my text for this glacier, that was first and foremost in my mind, is kind of coming up with a fictional collapse that killed people and resulted in the closing of that viewing location. So another thing, just to this is kind of a mock-up of what I'm thinking of for exhibition type purposes, is actually, this is the same text basically that I showed before, but I was trying to basically come up with a museum placard, the kind of thing, the sign you would see in the museum that would go along with these pictures, and trying to come up with this. And so I'm still playing around with these ideas. I'm not sure what I'm actually going to end up doing with it, but just to kind of give you an idea, you have the little infographic, with the White Mountains collapse, and, have the text, and trying to make it, it's a surprising amount of information out there about what kind of fonts museums like to use, and the way the style of writing, and so on and so forth. Maybe there's a curator in the audience here, but so let's move on. So another pretty popular glacier is this one, the Sólheimajökull. And if you haven't figured out already or didn't know, the Jökull, the J-O-K-U-L-L, that means glacier in Icelandic. So this is another one that's quite a large scale. It's like it's probably, again, quarter mile across type of scale in terms of these photographs. And this one, in researching this glacier, it was pretty interesting because they this is a glacial tongue again of a larger ice cap, larger glacier, and what the scientists are expecting is that as basically the larger glacier is holding back the volcano underneath, essentially, and as the glacier melts away, the volcanic activity is expected to increase and dramatically increase. And so some of there was that recent volcanic explosion a number of years ago that interfered with air travel and such in Iceland, but they're expecting a lot more of that. And it's something I never would have thought of, is that the retreat of the glaciers would result in more volcanic activity. But it's another lesson as to the interconnectedness of these different natural processes. Another very well-known location that I went to is what's kind of known as there's the thing called Diamond Beach is right next to this, but essentially it's this glacial lagoon, which is what that name means, glacial lagoon, that you've probably seen these pictures, but essentially it's a retreating glacier, a giant lagoon in front of it, and the ice melting off and forming these icebergs in front of it. And it's quite large and very, very crowded with people, but amazing. And people actually take boats out into it. And what's even kind of crazier about this place is that it's right next to the ocean, and the icebergs, as they melt, they float out into the ocean, and they're washed back by the waves onto the black sand beach. So you end up, with these scenes of icebergs melting on black sand beaches, and it's kind of very iconic. But what's interesting is that, you know, that process, the fact that this is happening is actually only happening because of the warming of the planet and the melting of these glaciers, because essentially it is that retreat of the glaciers that forms the lagoon and then icebergs that are able to flow out there. And as it retreats further away, that's not going to happen anymore because it's going to be too far away from the ocean. You're not going to have a clear path, or they're going to melt before they get there. So it is something that is kind of a spectacle now that likely will not exist, you know, at some point in the not too distant future. Okay, one last glacier, and this is in the western side of the island that I went to early, and this one, the weather conditions were actually horrible those first couple of days, and I mentioned that before. But this was one where I was very keen on, you know, but I was able to get the results that I really loved out of this, because I really wanted to try to capture how tenuous the remnants of this glacier are as it goes, and so the photographs I kind of created as part of this were very reflective. They're very true to the scene, but also true to the kind of the emotional impact of that location for me as well. And you know, this glacier, you know, kind of from you know, was famous in literature, in Jules Verne, and it's also kind of on its, you know, getting close to its last legs, I guess we'll say. So in that same area, I also, you know, glaciers are the iconic symbol of climate change and warming, and they're powerful because of that. But it's not just about that, of course, too. And so as I've expanded my project into other areas and other parts of Iceland, and then now into other parts of the world here in the United States, I've explored a lot of different aspects as well. And, you know, one thing that, you know, one clear example of that in Iceland is the waterfalls. And, you know, there are waterfalls everywhere in Iceland, you know, partially because of all that rain, but a lot of these waterfalls are actually glacier fed. And once the glaciers go away, then the waterfalls are going to go away too, at least in any kind of consistent fashion. They may still appear during rainstorms and that sort of thing. And so there's, you know, as part of the book I'm putting together and the portfolio I'm putting together, I talk about these sort of things too, the waterfalls themselves. And I think it's important to recognize that it's not just the picturesque glaciers, it's these other things as well. This is also in that western area of Iceland. This one is kind of just a precursor for the next photograph, just to kind of give you perspective. This is this canyon that I went to go visit, and actually you can't see at the bottom, but you could actually walk into the canyon at the bottom. And this next photograph is actually looking up from within the canyon. That's just to give you a little idea. But they, you know, it was just that's, you know, a very large, you know, I'm pretty deep there. It's probably 100 feet deep at least. And there were so many birds around there, you know, different types of terns mostly, and gulls. But and so I use photographs like this as a vehicle for talking about different wildlife and impact on wildlife. And, you know, from what I can from my understanding of the literature on this, is that much of the diversity of the bird species in Iceland now is, you know, going to go away. Essentially, the combination of temperatures on the birds and also the impact onto the food sources of the fish in the sea is going to have that kind of double whammy impact on them. So along the lines of these waterfalls, I'm going to show you just some other waterfalls that I was able to visit, just mostly because I have a few more that fit with the project, but also just because they're just kind of wonderful, these wonderful examples. And so these are all glacial runoff waterfalls. And so that contributes a lot to the color. If you go to Iceland in the spring, the color of the water is often different. It's browner because you're having more of the spring runoff, and it gets bluer as the season goes on. So this is Dettifoss, another a very well-known waterfall in Iceland. And just a few photographs of that one. And this is Gullfoss, another one. You can kind of see a variation. My camera's not on the tripod this time, it's in my hand, but using my phone to take a picture. But again, it was raining and there was the mist from the waterfall. So it's just, again, kind of always damp in some fashion. Okay. And yeah, you can see how many, I mean, just the waterfalls are, I mean, obviously there's the big waterfall, that's the attraction here, but then the cliff wall has all these little waterfalls that are happening as well. And one of my favorite waterfall is this waterfall called Dettifoss. And this just kind of shows you it's a giant waterfall. It's mostly glacier fed, and it's just incredibly powerful. It's a large drop and a very high volume of water. And so what I ended up doing was I was trying to capture just the power of it in some way. And so these are very short exposures, like, 1/3000th of a second, which I had to do in order to have it be, really razor sharp at different scales, because I make really large prints out of these, like 30 by 30 prints. And even what's amazing about like Dettifoss, for example, is that I think in 100 years it's still going to exist, but in a much diminished form. One interesting thing about it is that the expectation by scientists is that these waterfalls are actually going to become briefly more powerful as the glaciers melt more. There'll be more water coming down, but until they're not, until that water starts running out, until the glacier starts running out. And so this is the most powerful waterfall in Europe, and I don't know what's in second place and whether that's going to be impacted by glacier melt or not. But it's it may not maintain that position. It's certainly it's expected to be in a much diminished form in the future, 70 years from now. So okay, so I kind of went through quickly at the end there, but I wanted to thank everyone for coming out tonight. And if you want to see more information, more photographs from my Iceland trip, but also from the other projects I'm working on in other areas in Montana and the Northern Rockies with Montana and Alberta, British Columbia, or also areas like the Southwest of the United States. And so I'm in the process of putting together different versions of this, of kind of surveys of these different areas. And obviously travel in 2020 has not been as easy as it has been in the past. And I'm looking forward to being able to go out and do more. And actually, it's funny because I really haven't done a survey for New England and for Maine yet. I don't have enough photographs that fit with this project yet. So certainly staying close to home is an option for me as well. And so stay tuned. Hopefully this project will keep on going. And again, hopefully, I hope it's a vehicle for increasing awareness, through its different forms in climate change and the impact of it on, everything from glaciers in Iceland to lakes in Maine and all kinds of other things. So cool. So thank you again.
Thank you, Jim. I have a couple questions that have come in.
Yeah.
And if you have more questions, people, please write them in the chat and I'll be monitoring them. Also, if you want to speak your question in person, just let me know. The first question that came in is, what was the purpose of the photographic fellowship or artist residency? What did they want? And what did you want?
Oh, excellent. So so what they wanted, so the selection process was based on, the vague idea of merit, but also photographers who were interested in kind of macro or close-in views of the natural world. So they kind of wanted people with that inclination to come there. Mm-hmm. And what the expectation was, a lot of residency programs, as Sue mentioned, I've done different residencies, but some residency programs, they have a requirement that you give something back to the residency program. And usually it's a piece of artwork that you created as part of the residency. And so they didn't really have that requirement. They had a printer there, which I was able to get working. And so we ended up printing small pictures to leave behind with the woman who ran the program, but that wasn't a requirement for it. So really most residency, and I say that's pretty typical for a residency program, that they don't, maybe they want one piece of artwork from it, but generally speaking, the idea is that it's more of a one-way street. They're trying to offer this to artists as a chance to escape from everyday life. And so what I was looking for myself was exactly that, in a way, is that, I have a young daughter, I have a business, a printing business and teaching and et cetera. And it's really hard for me to work on my own work. It's like, it's hard to carve that time out for yourself. So it's a way of kind of forcing that to happen. And certainly in the case of Iceland, it was an excuse to go there. It was, I could on my own go and tell my wife, I'm going to go photograph in Iceland for 2 weeks for work. And she would actually be fine with that, but I'd feel too guilty about that. But if we put it in terms of a residency, that's something that has a cachet to it and is competitive, then if I feel less guilty about that. And so it's something that I approach a little bit differently. And so, yeah, that's kind of my motivation, and even though the residency was meant to be focused on the small details, I really was mostly looking forward to seeing the glaciers. That was kind of as you could probably tell from the presentation. So thank you.
Jim, I think I'll follow that line sometime when I go into residency. Thank you.
Yeah, so
someplace. Something that another question that Bill has, I'm wondering if you could Photoshop some of your photos to graphically contrast now and then in your project.
I've thought about that. I found some historical photos. I mean, for me, I don't have my own photos that are historical that I can compare it to, but I looked at doing that, and I could see that probably making the most sense in kind of a book form, as a way of trying to demonstrate things. So I've been playing around with that, but I haven't come up with the look that I quite like on that. And so I think it's a good idea, but I think that I haven't quite found, because of my kind of fictionalized idea that I have here for this, it doesn't work as well with that, because I can't photograph what it's going to look like in the far future. But I could come up with something like, in 1950 it looked like this, and 2000 looked like this, and then try to extrapolate from there. So it's a good idea, but I haven't been able to quite make it work yet.
Thank you. I was in Iceland last year and then in Greenland, and I noticed when I was there, and I was there about a year ago at this time, maybe a month earlier, there were a huge number of tourists that were there. Have you when you were there, did you have the opportunity to notice or think about the infrastructure of Iceland, which doesn't have a very big infrastructure, and the impact on the environment by all of the artists that are there and how they may change their artistic environment?
Yeah, I think that's a excellent question, and there's a lot of aspects to it. When I went, because I went north and spent most of my time up there, there are very few tourists up there. It was pretty shocking to me to get down to the south where everybody else was, and to see, and the stuff in the south is not necessarily more beautiful. It's just that it's closer. It's a half day from Reykjavik, so you can, it's more accessible. And so so that part was a little shocking. I think there's no doubt the Iceland infrastructure isn't geared towards the amount of tourism they've had, but I also think if you've been here in Maine in the summer, Iceland's not so bad. It's going to Acadia, in terms of the number of people. And but I do realize that there is, obviously, because a lot of photographers want to go there, and a lot of artists, and I think, this is something I struggle with as an artist and as a citizen of the world, is the balance of trying to use artwork to increase awareness of climate change while contributing to the problem by traveling different locations. So I'm trying to be efficient with how I do it, but that's something I know that's always tugging at the back of my head as an interest. So I think that is, I think that was implicit in your question. And so that's something I'm very cognizant of, and try to tried to minimize the impact as much as possible because of that.
Right, and how we as photographers leave the impact of our tromping around on environment.
Oh, right, absolutely. It's, like that, one of the waterfalls I showed that was the smaller one I showed first, the tourism, not just photographers, but just tourists, like it was on private land and they had opened it up to people and it was kind of off the beaten path, but it was in enough guidebooks that so many people had gone there that the trail was just this mud path essentially. And the landowners had blocked it off, which is not something that culturally happens much in Iceland. People don't want to do that, but they had to because so many people were coming and there was no infrastructure, there's no path to get to that. And yeah, I think it's something they've struggled with.
Do you have plans to go back into that area over time to look at changes?
I would love to. And so I don't have anything concrete, but I definitely have nebulous plans to do so. Partially because I want to see changes, but also because I only scratched the surface. I was only there for 18 days and I was not able to spend very long anywhere. So I knew that going in, it was the trade-off. I wanted to see a lot of stuff, but I couldn't go deep. And so I want to go back for both those reasons, to see how it's changed and to see the things like the interior of Iceland and see other things I didn't get a chance to see on this first trip.
Also, I don't think I mentioned this in the beginning, that you are presently the main media artist in residence in book arts, which was to have been a residency in the year 2020.
Yes.
Now has to be extended. What did you speak about that project? Or could
Sure.
you speak about that project?
So the project, so basically the book artist in residence at Main Media is a relatively new program, just a few years old. And the idea is there's a book art studio for making handmade artist books there in Rockport at the main campus. And for the residency, you get access to and a small stipend to the book artist studio. And the project that I submitted for and was accepted as the book artist in residence actually relates to this project and this trip to Iceland. And so I'm basically putting this combination of photographs and text into book form. And I happen to have a small mock-up here, which is right here, which is basically where I make these prints and put them into book form. And I know you really can't see much here, but that hand bind it, and it's all kind of handmade. And my expectation is that I was working on the residency when the pandemic hit and the studio closed, and I think it's likely going to pick up again this winter in some form. So hopefully be able to finish a project. But the end result is I'm hoping to have a large edition of the handmade books that include these Iceland pictures plus some of the photographs from other areas too. It's not just Iceland specific. It's broader than that. But the Iceland is definitely 40% of it probably.
Thank you. So we had another question come in. This was a real insightful presentation, which is a comment. And the question that goes with it is New Zealand on your list?
Oh yes, you should see my list. So it's pretty much everywhere is on my list. But I mean, New Zealand would be close to the top 5 for sure. And Antarctica, Greenland, go back to Iceland, New Zealand, Chile. There's a lot of things. I've thought about trying to make this a broader project in glaciers across the world, but I'm not sure I can sell that here in the household, that I need to travel to glaciers all over the world quite yet. But I am, but I do want to broaden it. But New Zealand would be very high on my list of places to go.
Thank you. Are there other questions? What I want to do is, if I can, I'd like to screen share for just a minute for everybody. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Somebody say yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. This is just one of the events that we have on for community events for the Camden Conference that occur on the coast of Maine, in Belfast, in Rockland, in Camden, and also in southern Maine. And for those of you who have not been to the Camden Conference, and I know there's some people on this call who don't live in this area, the Camden Conference is at camdenconference.org, and it was founded in 1987 as a nonprofit, nonpartisan educational organization to foster informed discourse on world issues. And the community events are a prelude to what happens in February. And this year, the Camden Conference in 2021 is live from the Camden Opera House. The videographers will be in the Camden Opera House. The rest of the conference will be streamed in virtual on Zoom, a wonderful thing for you to do in the midst of winter when it's really cold and dark. It's February 21st and 22nd. There are lectures, there are discussion groups. The head of the Camden Conference that helps organize it in this area is Matt Storin, the former editor of the Boston Globe. And David Brancaccio, who was the host for last year's Media Revolution topic, is coming back as the host this year. You can look on the Camden Conference website to look at the programming, and also a wonderful thing for the reading nerd that comes along with it is a suggested reading list that you can do before you come to the conference. So there's information on registration and on the conference, and you can enjoy it this year from your home in sweatpants and pajamas. So thank you, Jim, for being with us tonight. Thank you, Rocky Library, for hosting this. And you can look on the Camden Conference website to look at the future lectures that are related to community events and also for the conference planning and programming. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Well, thank you, everyone.